All right, here we go. Ready to do this? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Oh, very good. Thanks for having me, man.
We
Looking
are
forward to this.
absolutely thrilled to have you. I mean, I got to say, you come with a lot of pedigree to this conversation. You're a pretty popular dude, and you've got some pretty massive chops. And I know that there's been a lot of interest in this live stream for good reason, and we're going to get right into that in a second here. But before we do, I just want to have a quick shout out to our friends at Sony who actually made this whole talk possible. So big thank you to them. If you guys are at all interested in Sony gear, as both Dave and I are, there is a couple Sony reps as well as our own Vistek reps that will be active in the chat box. So if you have any specific gear related questions, they are there to answer those questions. Also, there'll be a link to a bunch of great Sony deals that are happening right now as a result. So you'll find that link in the chat box as well. And I think Sony released a brand new 14mm 1.8 lens today. So that's pretty exciting. That's a rare piece of kit, and so Sony always the innovator. So anyways, thank you, Sony, so very much. I'm excited. You're in for a treat, guys. An hour of chatting with Dave here. Dave, I'm a big fan of your pedigree. You come from the film world.
Thank you.
As a rigging gaffer, a man after my own heart, and an avid traveler, to which you have had considerable accolades. My apologies. So I know that a lot of people are interested in not just your wildlife, but also sort of your travel experiences. And you've got a 45-minute presentation for us today. But I want, for the audience members who don't know you that well, who are just kind of tuning in going, who's this Dave character? Dave, give us a sense of your, I love your story. I think it's a fantastic story with you and your wife. Why don't you give us a little bit of sense of where you've come from and how you got to where you are right now?
Yeah, for sure. For me, like my photography journey really started when I was a lot younger. Obviously, I was given my first camera when I was like 12 years old, a Canon AE1 with a 50mm lens. And I really sort of fell in love with photography then. But I did a little bit of photography and stuff like that through high school, but it really wasn't until I got into the film industry that I really started to take it seriously. So I worked in the film industry for 15 years before doing what I'm doing now. And I absolutely loved it. I was really fortunate in that I got to learn from some really incredible cinematographers, and really learn about light. And it really piqued my interest. And I love taking what I learned from those guys and translating it into and applying it to my photography. I've done a lot of different types of photography, that's for sure. I was shooting a lot of street photography. I had a portrait studio where I was shooting portrait photography with a Hasselblad 501C, that kind of stuff. But it wasn't until my wife and I decided to change our lives and actually set out and try and make a completely different business than the film business. And it wasn't because I hated what I did. It's just that I felt that I was as far as I could go before I would have to change. So for those who don't know, I was a rigging gaffer in the film business. So co-head of the lighting department. So if I wanted to move up, I would have had to move over to the camera department or something like that. But the beauty about the film industry is it allowed us to travel during the winters. So we would take off for like 5 months and go and travel somewhere because a lot of movies back then, I won't say how old I am, but it was a while ago when I was working there. And, they wouldn't really come and shoot in the winter. Most of the stuff would be done in the fair weather months. So we would end up leaving. And that's when I really fell in love with travel. And when we decided to switch our careers, we really decided, let's try and make travel a career. And really, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know how to do it. We decided we had to do something to stand out. So adventure travel was kind of our niche of what we wanted to do. So we decided, okay, in order to stand out, do something, I want to kick things off by, the idea was to get a TV show. That was the idea, because we were in film and television, so we wanted to get a TV show. So we thought in order to do something epic, or in order to stand out, we have to do something epic. So we decided to cycle the continent of Africa from Cairo to Cape Town, the world's longest cycling race, 12,000 kilometers, 4 months of cycling, and use that as sort of a springboard for our next adventure and the TV show. Which was pretty amazing. We got a lot of coverage, a lot of publicity through that. We hired a publicist, all that kind of stuff. And while this race was going on, I was also photographing the whole time heading down in Africa as well. So it was quite an adventure. But obviously the TV show didn't take off, and we had to sort of regroup and find out what we wanted to do. And that's when we decided to start the website, and decided to say, okay, we're going to take 5 years and go and travel full time and try and make a go at this and combine our photography and our writing and try and make a career out of it online. And then there's not really anybody doing that at that time, especially online. So it was a lot of trial and error, and not only a lot of trial and error with the travel blog, but also learning photography along the way. I'm self-taught, so taking those principles I learned in the film industry and applying them when I was on the road, I got a hard and fast education of what works and what doesn't, and just been developing my skills from there. And luckily the blog did take off, and we're sort of considered now in like sort of the travel industry as some of the OGs as far as that goes. I guess I'll wear that with a badge of honor. And so we did end up traveling full time for 9 years, so no home. Just traveling from place to place for 9 years, exploring, working for different destinations, companies, brands, all that kind of stuff in a whole bunch of different aspects. So that's sort of how we developed our brand, and our moniker is Adventure is for Everyone, and that's sort of a motto that we developed at the very beginning and have stuck with since the beginning, and it translates really well, and it's sort of how we live our life. So that's sort of our story in a nutshell.
How do you feel about the effect of the contribution of your partner? I know a lot of people out watching are maybe just they're by themselves. They may not have they might have a romantic partner, but they may not share in sort of creative or business or things like that. But how key was that to your success? Do you think this is something you could have managed if you were single or just on your own, if your partner was in another business, another industry? What's your experience with that?
Definitely not. Her support and her being there, not only just in the emotional support side of things, because doing it alone, I don't think I could have done, or maybe I wouldn't have had. She tends to be the one in the relationship that's the one pushing us out of our comfort zone and wanting to try different things. And, we've been together since 1991 for a very long time. So, that's really rubbed off on me. But, just the workload itself, it's pretty hard to have done with just one person. But I think creatively, she is my biggest fan, but also my biggest critic, which also makes me better in everything I do. So I think having that with me wherever I was just elevated my photography, all of my creative talents to something that maybe it wouldn't have been had I been on the road by myself.
Wow. I'm very eager to get into your presentation here, but I do have a couple of questions. And I just want to also mention for those asking questions in the chat, please do so. We want to hear your questions. We obviously, because of time constraints, can't get to every single question. But some of the questions we're going to open up a Q&A at the end. And so if you've got a question, I'm seeing all the questions that do come in here. And a lot of those I probably will port to the end of our conversation today. But if it's relevant to, I think, what Dave is talking about, I'm going to make sure that I stop him and ask him. And as questions come in early but might be relevant later on, I'll ask them at that point. So please be patient, but also please keep asking those questions. We love it. But my question is, there's usually an epiphany moment for a lot of artists, and we know your story in terms of like you guys were traveling, and you're like, this is such a special experience that we want to make this into our career. But is there any anecdotes along the way, like a moment in that travel, a moment in those experiences, maybe beyond the bike race that really sold this to you? That was like, this is what I'm kind of meant to do from this point on. Can you think of anything like that?
Yeah, I was actually, we had done a few travels beforehand, but it wasn't until we left for the full-time trip that and this was after the bike race and everything, that it was really a reality that we were doing this. So, and I remember two instances actually. I remember being in India. So we went and we spent 4 months in India, traveling India, which is an adventure unto itself. But I remember being down in Ranthambore National Park, and watching the photographers there photograph wildlife. And I had not really, at this point, really been a huge wildlife photographer. But I remember having some conversations with the guys there, and basically about, oh, you know what, it's a great talent to have, but it's probably one of the more difficult, and if anybody, and I do talk about this in my presentation a little bit, but if anybody listens to me talk before, I'll always say that travel photography is the most difficult type of photography, just because you have to be good at so many different things, including wildlife photography. But that moment, and also down in Sri Lanka, I was in Sri Lanka at Yala National Park. And remember getting a sighting of a leopard. It has the highest concentration of leopards in the world down there. And obviously I was not equipped at all, equipment-wise, to photograph wildlife. But there was a truck just ahead of us. They got a spotting of a leopard, and these guys came in and they all had like these huge long lenses and that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to get good shots and all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't until we got back to the actual lodge and I sat down and talked to these guys and looked at their images, and they talked about making a living doing this and how this was really such an incredible way to make a living. And I had obviously already had a major interest and been inspired by other people in my life to make photography in my career. But it wasn't really until that point where I sat down and talked to you guys that I think it really clicked in my head that, wow, I can really make this a bigger part of what I'm doing, as opposed to just being sort of a side thing with the blog. Yeah. So that was a really special moment in that, that I can sort of relate to being a pivotal moment in me focusing more on my travel photography than just sort of it being a side hustle to what the blog was doing.
Yeah. Is there, I find wildlife photography so fascinating. We've spoken on this channel to many wildlife photographers, and what impresses me about you, Dave, and I'll be honest, is that a lot of these wildlife photographers who do well and are really well known, they have a lineage or a background of working in that world, before they even got into photography. Like, they knew the wildlife world. They were either
right.
conservationists. They went to school for that, and they had this really intense connection to the land and to the animals. And here you come, some gaffer years down the road, and now you're snapping photos that are just as rich and enriching as the ones that they do, which is really confidence inspiring for a lot of amateur wildlife photographers, thinking that, like, I don't have, the background for this, but you've proven otherwise.
Right.
Anything in particular that you can isolate in terms of what's helped you launch into that ability to be able to get the images that you can, considering your background?
I think a lot of it has to do with my dedication and passion for each individual type of photography. So when I started out, it was really all about landscapes. I love landscapes, and I still do. Mm-hmm. I still love shooting landscape. It's amazing. I love it. It's part of telling the story. But with wildlife photography, it posed such a challenge for me. Because it was unlike any type of photography that I had done before. There is obviously a little bit of comparison towards maybe portrait photography, but not in a controlled environment like I was shooting. Right. So I think my passion for it and my love for actually getting out there and learning about animals, like you said, I didn't come in with the knowledge of knowing all about the behavioral aspects of a lion or a cheetah or anything like that. But what I tried to do is I tried to partner myself with people who did know that. And I think that really helped me elevate my photography when I'm out there with a guide or anything like that. I always have someone with me who has a great knowledge of that particular animal. And by using that knowledge and pairing it with my knowledge of photography, it sort of gave me, an insider knowledge of what's going on. And the key, and you'll hear it from every great wildlife photographer of great shots, is to know the behavior of the animal. And I think that is super important in order to anticipate what's going on and to be in the right place at the right time. But I also think like being a wildlife photographer can also be educational and allow you to learn about the animal and go back again and again so that you can be in that position and practice and practice and practice. And I think that's one of the things that really elevated my wildlife photography is I practice like crazy. I'm out in the backyard, photographing chipmunks, wherever I am. I'm just trying to get out there and test my abilities because there's so many different situations, there's so many things that are uncontrollable in wildlife photography that aren't in landscape or city photography. The challenge and the passion and practice is really what does it.
Amazing. Well, I'm excited to get into these images, so why don't we get started here? I don't want to keep people waiting any longer with my yakking. Why don't you take it away, sir?
All right. We're all good. Everybody can see my presentation?
I sure hope so.
Excellent. Well, I'm really excited to share these wildlife tips with everybody today because, wildlife has always been like a big part of my travel photography, as I was talking about earlier with Dale. But what I've really found is that in recent years, I have really developed this passion for it. I can't wait to get out in the field and spend time with the animals and witness their behavior and learn about them and then capture those moments with my camera. I love how wildlife photography challenges me to think outside of the box and use different techniques and different settings and stuff like that in different ways than I would use in landscape photography or other types. So it is really challenging, and I love a good challenge. So wildlife photography does that for me. And truthfully, I'm a storyteller. That's what I do with my images. I like to tell the story of a destination or whatever the subject of the photograph is. And in order to tell the story of a destination, you have to encompass all aspects of that destination. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up focusing a little bit more on wildlife photography, because obviously capturing a destination through landscapes and cityscapes is, I hesitate to use the word generic, but it's simple in the sense that you know what to go and shoot. But when you're introducing wildlife photography into it, which is a huge part of promoting a destination and sharing the beauty of a destination, it takes a lot more work because there's a lot of variables that are not anticipated with wildlife photography. So I've learned a lot over the years, all by trial and error of what works and what doesn't, and how I've adapted shooting with other photographers and all that kind of stuff. And that's sort of the basis of the tips that I'm going to share with you guys today, and as a result of what I've done in the field, not what I've read in a textbook. So let's get into it, right? All right, so what we're going to cover today is we'll cover a few different things. Talk about some techniques that you can use in the field. I'll talk about how to set up your camera, some settings that I use and things that I think that you should use in order to help you bring back better images. I'll also get into some quick tips to help you improve your shots. And finally, we'll talk about gear and gear suggestions, which is always usually the longest part of the chat because everybody's a gearhead, including myself. So I'd love to talk about gear, but I put that at the end. So if there's any questions, we can do that as well. So I'll give you a little idea of what we're going to cover today. But first, a little bit about me. I know you got a little bit of history earlier on about my roots and where I came from, but I've been, to sort of summarize that, I've been a professional travel photographer for 10 years now. I've traveled to over 115 countries on all 7 continents. I've been featured by, places like National Geographic, BBC, Lonely Planet, Red Bull, shot for a lot of different brands like British Airways, Expedia, that kind of stuff, as well as a lot of my travel photography, a lot of my work is focused around different tour companies and that kind of stuff to help them promote their to promote their tours. So wildlife photography is a big part of destination photography, so that's why it's such an integral part when you're trying to tell the story of a destination. So let's look at some techniques that you can put together, that you can focus on when you're out there taking wildlife photos. And a lot of these are basically things that you need to think about before you press the shutter button. And I know that can only be a split second sometimes, but I guarantee if you take a couple seconds to just think about these things before, and like before you maybe even actually set up your frame, as well as before you press the shutter button, guaranteed they're going to make your images more impactful and have a little bit more effect on the viewer. So number one we'll talk about is focus on the eyes. And I think this is probably the most popular thing that every wildlife photographer will talk about. The eyes are so important because, well, for a lot of reasons, but for me, it's because it's human nature, right? If you where something has eyes, where's the first place you're going to look? First place you're going to look is right at their eyes. So if their eyes are not in focus, you're probably going to move past that image, or, go, this is no good, and move on. So it's very imperative that you place the focus on the eyes, especially if the animal is walking directly towards you, and you have both eyes right in the frame, like this particular shot of this lion that was taken in Tanzania. And this is a kind of an interesting story too. We were, one of the things you'll see that go on throughout this presentation, or the common thread, is patience and time in wildlife photography. And a shot like this, we spent about 2.5 hours with these 3 males, maybe 3 hours with these 3 males, who were basically lazing around, because that's what lions do. They're probably the laziest animals on the savannah, I would say. They just get up to hunt. They don't like to waste energy. But I had taken a bunch of shots of them while they were sitting around, but I really was looking for a particular photo. I really wanted a shot of a straight-on shot of an animal, or of a lion looking right at me, with an interesting expression. That was my goal. So I got really lucky in the sense that, when this guy did get up, I focused right on his eyes. I'm shooting this at 600 mil, focused right on his eyes, and had him come walking toward me, and burned off just a bunch of shots when he was licking his chops. So that sort of gives me a little bit different than, your standard lion photo or lion portrait photo, that actually adds a little personality to the animal as well. But just think about it. If you looked at that and the eyes were out of focus, or I had focused on his tongue, or I had focused on his mane, it would be a garbage shot. It would have been gone. So my main focus here was basically, no pun intended, to get those eyes as sharp as possible. So whenever you have an animal in the frame, you want to focus on those eyes, or focus on exactly where you want the viewer to look in that particular image. Now, sticking with the old light theme, or sorry, the eyes theme, I would say catch light in the eyes is something that a lot of people, A, maybe not think about, or B, just don't have the patience to wait for. And it can really make the difference between a good photo and a great photo. Because I think it adds another, obviously we're talking about a 2-dimensional image here, but, it gives it a little bit more of a 3D effect, if you will, by just adding another sort of layer to the particular image. And this is a good example here. I was shooting this Columbus monkey in Kenya, and you can see the shot at the top there. His eyes are kind of flat and dull. There's no life in them. And it's kind of like, that's an okay image. But I waited for him to turn his head, lift his head, and catch the sky in his eyes. And that really made the image pop, and actually took the focus of the image and put it right into his eyes. So by having patience and waiting for catch lights and moments like this, I'm not saying that you can't burn off a bunch of images beforehand, but waiting for moments like this are the difference between good photographs and great photographs. Another technique or tip I want to give you guys is to get down on their level. I see this all the time when I'm out there photographing with other photographers. Is they'll rock up and they'll just set their tripod up at standing height and just start shooting, and not thinking about how much angle affects the impact of an image. Or they'll just, maybe they're just too lazy that they don't want to actually get down there. You can get lazy in your old age if you're out there photographing. So my recommendation is to try and get either on their level or below their level. I try and do this as much as possible because it creates intimacy in the image. So you feel a lot more part of the scene if you're down at their level and they're looking at your eye level than if you're photographing from above and looking down. That tends to be quite diminishing, and it will diminish the subject. When you're on their level or looking up, it makes them a little bit more dominant in the scene.
And Dave, if I
so
can...
a simple move by like this.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I can actually interject there with a question about that specifically, because, when I see that, that makes a lot of sense to me in the sense that, you want to have the sky in the background. If a leopard like that or a cheetah or whatever, if you're shooting up high, it's going to get lost in the terrain. It's going to be hidden in that and it won't stand out. When I see this though, and I see like how much your camera is connecting with the animal, what are some of the safety precautions that people have to keep in mind? I know some photographers and cinematographers shooting in Africa have just lied down underneath their vehicle, and that's protected them from certain animals like elephants and things like that. But what are some of the strategies that people can do to get this kind of shot, but also stay safe as well?
For sure. The key there is to have communication with your driver. I think that's the most important. And even this shot is a great example. When I was photographing this guy, he was sitting on a mound. So we were actually quite close up and I was shooting. And then I asked the driver to actually drive around and get further away so that I could get lower. So using the terrain to actually get lower, I don't get out of the vehicle when I'm in Africa or anything like that, but you can do a lot by just jockeying the vehicle to where you want it to be. And this is an advantage of using long lenses as well, because when you're thinking about angle, the wider lens that you use, the closer you usually have to get. And if you're close, you're going to have to, it'll be a much steeper angle that you're shooting the animal at. You would have to actually get down and lay in the grass. Whereas a situation like this, if you can place yourself further away, it actually makes the angle more shallow. So it kind of cheats that you are actually not shooting down on the animal, but you're at their level. So the more distance you can put between you and the subject, it will actually make the angle look a lot flatter than if you were close up to the animal. So think about that when you're in Africa, especially when you can't get out of the vehicle and move yourself around to actually do it. Try and use the landscape and what's around you to put yourself in the optimal shooting position. So that's what I do every time. I'm always looking. I'm sure the drivers get annoyed because I'm like, no, I don't want to be here. Because, most safari drivers, what do they want to do? Oh, they want to drive right up close to the animal and say, look, it's right here. That's not where I want to be. I'm shooting with a 600 mil lens. I want to be further back and I want to create separation and that kind of stuff. So I try not to get too close to the animals either. I'm not a big fan of I tell my drivers right at the very beginning, don't disturb the animal. If you can get further away, I'm okay to shoot with a longer lens in order to do that. But that's how you can get different angles even when you're on safari when you can't really get out of the vehicle. All right. This is another shot from that actual series, right? And the other of getting down on their level and actually shooting from below is that you create simplified background. So, like Dale was saying, even, if you're shooting down on it, it gets lost in the background. There's no way that you can make it stand out from what's behind you. So angle makes a huge difference, and just walking to the right or left or up or down can make the difference again between a great shot and a keeper and a non-keeper, right? Compose and then focus. This is something I see so many people do. They just are so excited. And I understand, I get it. You're super excited and you just get out there and you just start a shooting. And you don't care, what the frame looks like or anything, that kind of stuff. But I guarantee you, if you took 2 seconds to just compose the image before you set your focus point, it's going to make a massive difference in how that image looks to different people. It's literally maybe a 2-second thought of going, oh, let me just think about different compositional rules. I can use the branch of this of this tree to actually use the rule of thirds and compose this photo where it has the most impact, rather than just like burning off a ton of shots and hope some of them actually turn out. So remember this: take a breath, compose, set your focus, and then start shooting. Again, it's about not getting too excited. It's about taking a breath, taking the moment in, and going through a short mental checklist to make sure that these things are actually happening and what you can do to make them happen. And speaking of that, I do want to talk about foreground and background because I think that my photography really took a jump in quality when I started to pay a lot more attention to foregrounds and backgrounds. It's always an afterthought to most people. Ah, look at that. Look what's in the background. Ah, look at that. Look what's in the foreground. Instead of going, okay, how does this background for me? You know, I know the subject is going to be good, but let me think about the background. Maybe I move here and there, and it can make a completely difference. This monkey is a great example. There's way too much going on in this shot, man. I mean, like, when I look at this, you got the thorn almost in his face. You know, you got the trunk on the one side. There's a leaf that's obviously between me and the camera that is obstructing his arms. So there's just way too much going on here. And this is a case of me just burning off a whole ton of shots, trying to actually capture the moment and not thinking about what is happening. And maybe I could have moved to one side or the other to be able to capture a better composition and have less of a distracting background. Now, when you compare that with shots like, you know, this particular, I was shooting in Brazil, you know, I tried hard to move around and find a non-distracting background. Yes, there's still some highlights back there that maybe take away from it a little bit, but your eye is still drawn towards the eye of the particular animal. So another consideration you want to think about is distance. So distance between you and the animal, as well as the animal and the background. The more distance between the animal and the background, the easier it's going to be to push that out of focus with a shallow depth of field and make it more nondescript and distracting. You can't always do that. I understand that. You know, the toucan shot in here that I was photographing in Costa Rica is a prime example of that. When I look at that shot, there's really nothing much that I could have done. He's nestled in trees. It's pretty hard for me shooting from a boat. You know, like it's pretty hard at 600 mil shooting from a boat to, you know, get the bokeh effect and blur the background. So sometimes it's not going to happen. You just think about compositionally or color contrast and how you can move that subject out and make it stand out. But the best way you're going to do that is paying attention to the background and trying to make it not distracting. Lighting is another thing. It's my favorite thing to talk about. If anybody knows me, I can talk hours about lighting because it's what I did for a long time in the film industry. But I think it's a real talent to be able to utilize light in the right way when you're out there in the wild. It's not a controlled environment, but positioning yourself in the right place in order to create separation between the subject and the background at times where, you know, it's just not possible with, say, with a long lens or background that's out of focus. Like this hyena is a good example. Photographing, it was actually quite late in the day when we were photographing the animal, but, you know, the animal's pretty much the same color as the background, right? So how are you going to make him stand out? So I made sure that I had the guide position the vehicle where I could use backlight and side light in order him to separate from the background. Now it is a challenging lighting situation, so that's why I recommend you practice, and practice makes perfect. I say that with wildlife photography. Go out and different situations so you know what sort of exposure composition you need to do in order to either not make the face completely dark or blow the edge lights. So, but think about using lighting in order to separate your subject from the background. Time of day is another huge thing when you're thinking about photographing animals. For me, photography in general, especially if I'm talking about either landscapes or wildlife photography, if you can shoot like 15 to 20 minutes after sunrise, and say 15 to 20 minutes, maybe half an hour before sunset, that's when the light is at its best. It's golden hour. The light is soft. There's no harsh shadows. It's at a lower angle. It doesn't create crazy contrast. You know, if you're out there shooting in midday, like let's say, take for example this particular king lion, you know what? He's going to have top light. His eyes are going to be in shadow. You're never going to be able to get catch lights. You're going to be fighting the light. So what you want to do is put yourself out there at the best time of day when the light is the best, because then it's one less thing that you have to fight, right? Get out there early morning. I know most people don't like to do that, but you know, if you're going out on, be up early, trust me, because that's when they're all up. And get out there because you don't want to miss the best lighting, the best lighting conditions. That being said, I watch all my landscape photographer friends pack up their camera as soon as it's a cloudy day. I'm not going out today. I'm going to the bar. I'm not going to go out there and shoot. I'm like, this is the perfect time to go out and photograph birds. For me, I love shooting in overcast skies. It's soft, muted light that wraps around the subject. And I also think it's the best time to shoot colorful birds. Because again, you're not dealing with contrast, but because that wraps around them, it tends to pop the colors a little bit more. So don't put the camera away when it's bad weather outside. Get out there and shoot, because it's great lighting conditions for wildlife. Creative compositions. I wanted to put this in here because I think a lot of people, when they talk about or think about wildlife, it's all about shooting at, the longest lens possible. Let's, get that animal as big as I can in the frame, create those fine art shots. It's going to be awesome. But I also am a big advocate of going out there and looking for creative compositions, because all of my photos, I want them to be telling a story. I don't necessarily want it to be just about one particular image, but I'm shooting a series most of the time that I'm out there. And this is a good example. These 3 rhinos in Lake Nakuru National Park in Africa, out there early in the morning, as you can tell by the edge light on their ears and the horn, got out there early. And I was actually looking for a shot that told more of a family story. That's what I was looking for. So I could have photographed, waited for the male with the big horn to get by himself and go out and shoot that. But I thought, wouldn't it be great to get all 3 of them in the frame? And then when I looked at it, I'm like, so how am I going to do that and create depth and interest? And it's by stacking. So I'm thinking of different patterns and different ways that I can create depth in an image. And stacking wildlife is a good way to do that, or stacking any sort of subject will allow you to do that, and staggering them like this. I think this is a very kind of unique image that you don't really see of rhinos. They all tend to be very isolated and that kind of stuff. But I think this kind of family shot is something that's a little bit more unique. And that's what I'm trying to do in a lot of my travel photography, is or in a lot of my wildlife photography, is be more unique. I'm not trying to go after just the everyday shots or mimic what other people are doing. I'm trying to develop my own style. And to that vein, I'm always looking for groupings and symmetry. That's something else. Thinking outside of the box and thinking, how can I take this in Lake Nakuru National Park is very famous for the millions of flamingos that are there. And that's a very big shot that you see all the time. All these flamingos against the background. And I did get a few single shots for sure, but I really wanted to look for something unique. So when I saw all these guys standing there just at the right distance apart, you know what I mean, with the reflections in the water and that kind of stuff, I was like, that would make a great wildlife image. So don't just limit yourself to individual images, and don't think within that tunnel vision. Try and expand how you want to capture actual animal and what story you want to tell in those images themselves. It will definitely add a different element to your photography. And what I found is that, a lot of the images that sell so well for me in my fine art are of groupings of animals, not the individual ones. Obviously, individual ones do well, but I was very surprised that these would go from a fine art point. So don't limit yourself by just shooting at 600 mil, and I'll talk a little bit about that down the road in the next section. And finally, leave some space. This is something that I, again, see a lot of beginner wildlife photographers doing. They're excited to have a super long lens. They just want to shoot at 600 mil all the time and cramp the image as much as possible. But a scene like this, or anything where an animal is moving, whether it be birds in flight or a coyote walking or elephants walking like this, you want to leave what I like to call negative space in the direction that they're walking. Compositionally, it just works better, and the frame together by leaving that space. If I had cropped in and just photographed these animals where the baby comes right up against the edge of the frame, the juvenile is on the back, it could be anywhere. It doesn't give a sense of place either. So think about leaving space. Space is not a bad photography. Trust me, it can really help add dynamics to an image. So those are a few techniques that you can think about in the 0.4 seconds you have before you press the shutter button. I'm sure you can go through all those and make the adjustments in time to get those once in a lifetime shots. No, but really, there are things that you should really think about. You don't need to always go through the mental checklist all the way around, but if one or two of those stick in your mind and you think about it before you press the shutter button, then I've done my job. Let's talk a little bit about some setup tips. This is setups that I use, and it's developed over the years. Really, it's not something that I started out shooting. The mode that I shoot in now is not mixed martial arts. It's actually manual auto, where I'm in manual aperture, I'm in manual shutter speed, and I use auto ISO. I've just found this gives me the most versatility and most control over the aspects that are most important to me. Now, when you're starting out, maybe you want to keep it in shutter priority, or maybe aperture priority, and play around with those and make sure you know exactly how they work and what sort of effect they have on the image before you jump to all manual settings, because it's something it has to be sort of second nature to do. And I always get the question, well, why auto ISO? Why wouldn't you put it in manual ISO for those people who are a little bit more advanced? But auto ISO, there's one less thing that I have to worry about, and it doesn't really have a bearing, or it doesn't have a super effect on how my image is going, or the effect that I want to come across with the image. But I will note that if you are using auto ISO in this particular configuration, that you want to go in and you want to set your cap, your ISO cap. In the Sony cameras, you can go in and you set your maximum ISO and your minimum ISO, and you want to go in and do this. And my suggestion is to set the highest ISO that you figure is tolerable for a great image, say. So, and set it at that and have it be there. Don't just let it go wild, because, some of the cameras, they can shoot up to 25,000 ISO. Not even going to be probably usable. So you want to set it to what your tolerance is, and that's really important when you're using this mode. Because, I've been shooting with other people, they're like, oh, I got to try out that mode you're using. And they're like, oh, my pictures are all noisy, they suck. And it's like, well, did you set your maximum ISO? No, what's that? So if you are going to use this mode, make sure that you actually set that part of your ISO. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself, you're going to come into scenes where you're going to have way too noisy of images, and it will be, well, your fault. But I did want to talk a little bit about metering here. I'm not going to get too much into it because it can get super complicated, but I do use multi-zone metering. I don't use spot metering when it comes to wildlife, just because I find that spot metering, it meters for middle tone. That's what spot does. So a lot of times, if you're photographing a subject that's a little bit darker and it's metering for middle tone, it's going to blow out the highlights in the back, and you're going to be fighting that. Whereas I find that multi metering, it averages it out, and it does a really good job, especially when it's paired with like a flexible spot focus mode. So that's what I tend to use, is I'll use multimeter all the time. I don't tend to use spot metering in any of my wildlife photography. If you have any questions about that, we can talk about it later on. Back button focus. This is something that a lot of people don't do, especially when it comes to the beginner wildlife photographers. And what back button focus is essentially separating your shutter button. When you get a camera and it comes set up, the typical thing is your shutter button, when you press it halfway down, it focuses, and then you press the shutter button and it takes the photograph. But the problem with this is that once you take your finger off of the shutter button and you go to press it again, it refocuses. This is horrible when it comes to wildlife photography. Let's take this this monkey here in Costa Rica. He was moving along the branch, and I'm moving around trying to get the best shots possible. I don't want my camera to continue to refocus. Once I hit that focus and set that focus, that's where I want it to be. So by assigning my focus to a back button on my camera and making it separate from the actual shutter button, then I'm able to take it, I'm going to press the button, I can focus, and then I can shoot away, move over here, compose, shoot away, and I'm not worrying about the camera refocusing. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you do, you'll be like, oh, I do it any other way. And a lot of these settings that I put in my camera are really all about making things easier and giving you control, because that's the most important thing. You want to control the things that are important to you to make the best impactful image. Expandable, flexible spot AF. This is what I use with the lock. I use this on my Sony camera. I love this. I use it either in small or in medium, usually, because it allows me to put the focus point exactly where I want it, exactly where I want the viewer to look. And what I love about the flexible spot, which you just move with the joystick on the back of the camera, especially with the AF lock, is that once you set that focus and you get it on, you set it on the eye and say the animal moves a little bit more, and this way it'll track with it. You're not going to have to end up refocusing every single time. It's such an incredible feature, and probably the only focus mode I shoot in when I'm shooting mammals or relatively stationary animals. If I'm shooting birds in flight, it's just not going to work. I found anyway, for me, it just doesn't work. I'll flip it over to zone mode for focus, and it tends to work a lot better for birds in flight. So my suggestion too is use the custom functions on your camera, or the custom buttons, I'm sorry. Set up custom buttons somewhere where you can quickly change focus modes when you need to, because that'll be really important, especially if you're photographing something like birds or something that goes from stationary to moving. The animal eye focus, I do get asked about this a lot, and I do use it. Incredible technology. It doesn't work in every single situation. For me, I don't use it when I'm shooting birds in flight. But if I'm shooting mammals or anything like that, this has become invaluable to me. When I look at a shot like this of this black bear walking towards me, the auto animal focus will focus right on the eyes and continue to track as this animal walks towards me. So I'm, after using it, confident that I'm going to get a super sharp shot no matter what happens with this guy walking towards me. So again, assign it to a custom button, turn it on and off as you use it, experiment, practice with it, see if you like it, see if it works for you, but it's a great function to take advantage of. And finally, drive modes. For me, the A7R3, I put it in high plus, so I'm shooting at the maximum at 10 frames per second. So if you are shooting wildlife, I do recommend you get super fast memory cards, especially if you're shooting with maybe an A7R4 where it's a 60 megapixel camera, or even with the new A1 or the A9, you're shooting at super high frame rate. You don't want to run into buffering. Buffering is, when you're out there shooting, blah, 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 then all of a sudden your camera goes pop, pop, pop. You're like, what's going on? Basically what's happening is it's buffering, is writing to the card. So you want to get the fastest card possible when you're out there photographing wildlife. Let's talk a little bit about a few quick tips that you can use to improve your wildlife shots. And I find these are things that people know, they just forget or don't bother thinking about when they're out there in the field. And the number one thing is the rule of thirds. I'd like to bring this up in all of my talks, not because I look at it as a rule. I don't. I look at it as more of a suggestion. I do have it turned on in my camera so that the actual layer is there as a reminder. So don't forget about rule of thirds when you're doing wildlife photography, because composition is just as important as focus to me. So using the rule of thirds as a reference is something that you should always be thinking about in your composition. Now, that being said, break the rules when you can, or when you find, not when you can, but when it's most effective. I find that when an animal is facing me straight on and looking me straight down the camera, that's when I want to put him right in the center of frame. I want him to be the most important thing that's happening. I'm not trying to show the environment. I think the best composition for an animal looking straight at you is straight down the lens. If you're only following the rule of thirds, he'd be off to the side. And I think that really takes away from an animal that's looking you straight in the eye. You want it of frame. So don't use it as, I'd say use it don't use it as a hard rule, but maybe as a loose rule when you're thinking about composition. Anticipate the action. I learned this, unfortunately, not early on in my career. So I missed a whole ton of shots by not really knowing the behavior of the animal, knowing how to anticipate what they're going to do. And we talked a little bit about this with Dale at the beginning, where, a lot of wildlife photographers have a background in animals, and they know the behavior and that kind of stuff. And I do recommend that you do that. If you can't, if you're unable to do that, I say make sure you partner yourself up with someone who can. And a shot like this leopard is a perfect example. We were in Tanzania, and I was with the guide, and the leopard, she was walking through the grass, and he's like, "You just wait." He goes, "Leopard is going to go up that tree, and you want to be ready for it." So what I did is I trained my lens on the trunk of the tree. I pre-focused. I got ready for the shot. She came walking up. Boom, boom. I got the shot. Everybody else is scrambling around with their settings, and they all missed it, and I got it. So by anticipating what the animal's going to do, it'll allow you to capture moments that other people normally wouldn't. When you're talking, a little tip about bird photography, if you're looking to get bird in flight shots, a good indication is that the bird will poop right before it flies. It's usually normal in every single bird. So if you know that, then when you're out there photographing the bird on, whether it be on a branch or anything like that, you see it relieve itself, it's probably getting ready to head out in flight, so you can switch your settings so that you're anticipating that. I do want to talk a little bit, I touched on it a little bit about color separation creating separation through color contrast, because you're not always able to get those soft backgrounds, or maybe you don't have a super long lens in order to create that bokeh effect or put it out of focus. And by knowing your sort of color wheel and what works best, what complementary colors are, and what contrasting colors are, can allow you to use that for separation. I find that cool colors tend to blend more into the background, and warm colors seem to jump off the page a little bit more. So when you look at these two photographs, the bison itself, I waited for this shot because he was standing up against a brown bush for like 20 minutes doing nothing. They don't move very, very fast again. So I had a pretty going to be walk. I actually moved the vehicle to where I could get pretty close to where I wanted the background to be, and sort of let him come to me, so that I could use the bright snow to offset his warm fur and make him stand out in the frame. And same with the flamingo on the right hand side there. There's not a lot of crushed background going on there, but the contrast between the blue of the water and the white and the pink of the flamingo causes it to really pop out and stand out in the frame. So just because you don't have a 600mm f4 lens that crushes every background that you pointed at, doesn't mean that you can't have the subject jump off the page. You can use color contrast to do that as well. Include the environment. A lot of people, a lot of travel photographers, a lot of wildlife photographers don't ever think about this. They should rock up with their 600mm lens and nothing else. For me, I always had two cameras on safari. I've got my super long lens, and I've got a 16-35, or I've got a 24-70 on another camera with me in order to capture images like this. I want to include the environment and tell the story of where this animal lives. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to take environment shots. And our environment shots are shots that put an animal in a certain place. This is a good example here of these two polar bears. We went up to photograph polar bears up at the Nook Lodge there on Hudson Bay, but we did it not in the winter. So every shot that you see of polar bears, 90% of them is them in the winter against white snow, which they're fantastic images, but I wanted something unique. By going up at this is, the cubs have come out, they've grown up a little bit, but it's not quite winter up there. So to see a white polar bear against a green background like that is very unique, and I wanted to capture that. So it wasn't just about getting tight shots of their faces and that kind of stuff, which I did get shots of, but I also got shots like this. So think about including the environment in your photographs as well. You don't have to have the whole animal. This is something that I learned early on. I was always trying to get the whole animal in the shot. You're not out there shooting for a field guide. Well, maybe you are. If you are, then, don't worry about any of these tips. But if you're out there trying to create the best images possible and tell the story of a destination, don't be limited by just trying to keep the whole animal in the shot. This is another good example when I was down in Galapagos photographing sea lions. These guys are all over the place down there. So it's pretty difficult to get a shot where they're somewhat isolated. And you're not going to get a whole body shot where they're isolated either. So I was looking for something that would draw the viewer into the shot, and not just by making it stand out from the background, but by focusing on its fur and its whiskers and its texture. It's not the eyes that draw you into the shot. It's actually the texture of the skin and the whiskers. And you're not going to get that in the rest of the body. And if I had stood back and took a shot of the animal, there'd be way too much distractions happening. Great to get in there and get tight with them as well. So it's sort of a contrasting advice, including the environment, because you want to be able to do both things. Both things create different types of images. And finally, you're going to find yourself shooting in slow shutter. It's just a natural thing. It's just going to happen. When it's bad weather outside, or, you're at, it's getting late in the day, and you're not going to be able to crank your shutter speed up to 1/1000th or 1/2000th of a second, not without getting a crazy noisy image. So you're going to have to shoot in some slower shutter speeds. And my recommendation for this, and what I found has worked for me, is that shoot in slower bursts. So if I'm going to photograph something in a low light, I'll only hold the shutter button down for a very short time, so that it takes maybe 4 or 5 shots. And I found that's a great way in slower shutter speeds that one of them comes out in focus. That's just from practice of what I've done. That's what I found. So it kind of, instead of not taking the shot because you think the shutter speed is too low, just take a few bursts, and you'll probably find that at least 1 or 2 of those will come out in focus and be keepers. So those are some tips and setup tips and stuff like that you can implement today if you want to go out photographing in your backyard, because you probably can't go anywhere else. So those are some tips that I hope that you can implement that will help bring your wildlife photography to even a higher level that I'm sure it already is. Now it's time to get into gear. I want to talk a little bit about this because it's obviously the first question that every photographer gets. What kind of gear do you use? And I'm going to give a few suggestions. I'll give a high-end suggestion, a mid-level suggestion, and a budget suggestion for bodies anyway, and then I'll talk about lenses. When it comes to bodies, Sony has so many incredible bodies out there for wildlife photography. And it really just depends on your budget. If you have all the money in the world, congratulations. You can probably go out and buy the new A1, which is an absolutely fantastic. But when I haven't used the A1, but as I've been doing research on it, I'm actually thinking about getting rid of a couple of my other cameras and get this one, because it's so much of what I would consider like an all-in-one camera. So it can do everything. It's great. It's great for a wildlife camera, shooting at, I think, 30 frames per second. It has a crazy amount of focus points. It's 60, I can't remember, off the top of my head, I can't remember how many megapixels it is, but it's quite big. So it's great for landscape photography. It's really an all-round photographer's lens. It's their flagship camera. But you will be putting out some good money for that. But if it's something that you're passionate about, or something that you want to make a career of, by all means, look at the A1. If not, look at the A9 and the A9 II. They're both very much wildlife-specific or sport-specific cameras, in that you can shoot at a high frame rate. It's a little bit, I think it's a 24 megapixel sensor. Off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure. You can probably ask Patrick down there. So you don't have to worry about buffering as much. It has a tremendous amount of focus points, especially when you're comparing it to like the A7R3 or the A7R4. It really is a wildlife specific camera. So if you are just nuts about wildlife photography and that's what you want to do, I certainly suggest the A1, the A9, or the A9 II. If you're looking for a little bit of a more all-round camera, I use the A7R3, but the A7R4 will be my next camera, just because I find it's obviously a little bit down in the budget level from the A1, but it does everything. I love it for landscape photography. It's good. It has enough to do wildlife photography. It really is, for me, with the most versatile camera that Sony has out there. For someone who does a whole bunch of different types of photography. That's not being said, it doesn't mean you can't use it for wide. I think you should. At 60 megapixels, man, you can crop for days with that thing. So it's absolutely fantastic. And for those people who are even at the pro level or even at the serious amateur level, I'd recommend the A7 R4 for you there. If you're a little bit more budget constrained, I definitely look at the Sony RX10 Mark IV. This is what I would call like a bridge camera. So moving from like a point and shoot up to a mirrorless camera with separate lenses, this sort of fits to between because it has a 24-600 lens on it. And I was super impressed at the quality of this camera. It actually like totally away. So if you are just thinking of getting into wildlife photography, or you're looking for something that's not as cumbersome, or you don't want to worry about different lenses or even put up the money to do that, then I definitely look at the RX10 Mark IV. It's an absolutely great beginner camera that you can go out there, get the feel for what it's like to shoot at 600 mil without having to grab a 600 mil f4 to go out there and do it. If you are shooting with separate lenses with an A7R4 or an A9 or anything like that, my go-to wildlife lens is definitely the 200 to 600 5663. Because I'm traveling a lot, I can't really walk around with a 600 mil f4. My wife really complains when I make her carry it, so I don't do that anymore. This one, at least I can put in my bag, heavy, she doesn't complain. And it's a super high quality lens. Like I was, again, super impressed at 600 mil for this thing. The image quality is fantastic. And, the other thing I do love about it is that it's super versatile. So I can go from 200 to 600 in a quarter of a turn. That's incredible, man. It's just like, it's so versatile. And when you're out there, it lets you be prepared for so many different situations. So if you're looking for a wildlife specific lens that's not really going to break the bank or your back, I would suggest the 200 to 600 from Sony. I think it's probably one of the best lenses that they've come out with in the last few years, like for wildlife photography for sure, and for me as a travel photographer. If you're, I forgot to go to this. Anyway, if you're looking for something that's a little bit more compact, I do suggest the 100 to 400. This is a GM lens, so a G Master lens, so it's very at the high end optically of their line. I highly recommend this. It's an incredible lens. You pair it with a 2x teleconverter, and it's fantastic for wildlife. So if you want a lens that's a little bit more versatile that you can use in other situations, I suggest the 100 to 400 and a 2x teleconverter with you as well. So those are sort of the longish lenses that I would suggest that you get. I would also say don't forget about wide-angle lenses. This is one of my most popular shots and most selling shots here. It was taken on a 16 mil lens on safari in South Africa. If I was just there with 100 to 400 or a long prime lens, I would have never ever gotten this shot. So it's very important to have a great wide-angle lens with you as well, or short zoom. Same with this particular photograph. I've won multiple awards for this shot of these penguins in Antarctica, and it was taken basically laying in penguin poop with a 16 to 35 millimeter lens. So not all wildlife photography has to be shot with super long lens. Think outside the box and think how you can create different images and different moods with the different lenses. A few other additional gear suggestions I'll say is you should definitely have a sturdy carbon fiber tripod, a bean bag if you're heading out on safari. These things are fantastic. This is one here. This is a bit of an advanced one. It has actually a mount right here that I can screw to the bottom of my lens, and I can move it around on the safari vehicle, and it gives me support. And finally, a teleconverter. 2x, I would say every wildlife photographer should have that in his bag. And the final element, to wrap this up, you better have it in your bag. To come with it is patience, because you are going to need it when you're out there. Just ask my wife. She sat there for 4 hours of me waiting for a leopard to come out of a tree. So not only you have to have patience, but whoever you're with should have it as well. And hopefully all these tips and tricks, and not tricks, but techniques and stuff like that, you can implement, and it'll help you bring back better wildlife shots when you're out there.
That's amazing.
That's it for me.
That's amazing. Well done. Bravo. I think, in terms of just, really action forward tips, I think this has been one of our best live streams for that, because, man, like, you can save these slides and be like, check, 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 make a checklist. And I think that's such a great launching pad for folks starting out, getting ready to do a lot of wildlife stuff. So thank you for putting that together. I want to make sure that we get to those questions. So we have about 4 or 5 questions that I've selected from the Q&A, and then we'll wrap things up. We'll give about 5-10 minutes for this. So the first question is this is from Kosku. He says he has a question, or he or she has a question about copyrights. If they sell an image to somebody, can they still use that image for personal purposes like presentation or in a YouTube video? What's your response to that?
It just depends on what license what license you've licensed to them. A lot of my licenses are non-exclusive. They can be one-time use. I don't tend to license anything in perpetuity or forever or across multiple channels. So when I license an image to somebody, it's always for a specific purpose and for a specific term. So if I'm licensing an image, it may be a 1-year or a 2-year term to be used in a particular type of advertising or print or digital. It's all defined in the license. So basically, they're not allowed to use it other than within the terms that is defined in the license itself.
Cool. Very, very cool. And presumably, if people are new to that world of licensing images, there's probably a lot of online resources that they can go to look up contracts or different examples. How did you learn about all this sort of stuff?
Yeah, because pricing and that kind of stuff was, again, a kind of, and licenses and all that kind of stuff. I went to the stock agencies, and I looked terms were and what their usage terms were, and sort of and what they charge for different types of licenses, and sort of used that, in what, and paired it with what I think my value is to come up with a price. So I don't use that as the sole pricing way of doing it or sole way of defining contract terms, but it's a good basis. So go and check out different stock agencies, because they give different licensing for different images at different costs. It can give you a good idea or a good base of where to start.
Cool. Thank you. And so the next one up is from Rob Verdin. Rob, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. He asks, how does Dave pick his guides for his trips, and what does he look for in a guide?
When I pick my guides for the trip, I'm looking for someone who's incredibly knowledgeable about the area. And I actually will ask the tour company, how long has this person been guiding? Where are they from? I try to make sure they're always local guides. And what I try and do too is, once I pick that guide, I tend to go and sit down with them the night before you go out on safari and just pick his brain and say, hey, this is what I want to photograph, that kind of stuff. I'm looking for your advice on animal behavior and that kind of thing. So don't be afraid to ask the tour company what kind of experience the guides have, because that can often determine what kind of help you're going to get while you're out there, whether you're going to be all on your own, because some guides, they don't like to talk, or they don't like to discuss the habits of the animals, whereas others love to. When I was in Tanzania, our guide there, George, he was an animal encyclopedia, man. He knew everything about birds, everything about the behavior of birds. And, these guys always impress me. They pick things out that I would never have seen. So having a good guide is invaluable for being able to come back with great images.
Amazing. Peter's Photography Adventures asks, what are you doing now with the pandemic lockdown? So now that you can't travel, how does a travel and wildlife photographer spend his time when they can't do either of those things?
Well, it's been a lot of going through images that I haven't been able to look at, being on the road full time for so long. It's a lot of do the contract and move on. So it's been a nice journey of discovery for me, discovering images that I had basically forgot that I have shot and gone through, and backing everything up, but still getting out there. I can still go out in my backyard here and photograph. There's a pond in my backyard, so I can go out there and photograph birds. There's an osprey that comes. So I'm out there trying to stay in practice, because I always find if I'm not out there practicing and I'm off, like, God, it's been like a year. It's insane. I'm going to go out there, I'm going to be rusty. So try and keep the chops up, and just get out there and try and photograph anything around. I mean, from a travel photography standpoint and landscapes, there's really not too much you can do. But wildlife photography is super easy in your backyard.
Very cool, very cool. And speaking of wildlife, one more last thing here. We've got actually two questions that I'm going to combine into one, and it's all regarding sort of birds in flight or birds. And Manny asks, first off, for birds in flight, do you prefer the 2 to 600 lens or the 1 to 400 lens? What's your thoughts on that?
I prefer the 1 to 400, actually, just because it gives me a little bit more space, and I pair that with the A7R3 so I can get in there and crop a little bit. I find birds in flight at 600 mil, it's pretty hard, man. At 600 mil to track and frame, it's pretty hard. So I would recommend birds in flight for me anyway, unless you're shooting from a gimbal and a tripod and something like that, and you have a huge ton of practice. The 100 or 400 is a much better option for birds in flight than shooting at 600 mil.
And then Larry asks, why not eye focus for birds? What is it specific about birds where you won't use eye detect? Because this is what I find. This is just my experience with the eye detect. Is I find that when you get into there's a lot going on in the frame, and there's a lot of things going on a bird's face. It tends to search more. So it has a little bit more difficult time locking on the eye. So I would rather, especially when it comes to photographing birds on a branch or anything like that, I would much rather rely on my placement of the focus point than that. And that's just from trial and error. I found it works really good for mammals, but just for me, maybe I'm making the error, I don't know. But I think that it doesn't work as well. And I think they're working on that. AI, it's going to get better and better and better. But if you're ever in doubt that it's not going to work, flip it over to your flexible spot and use that. Very cool, very cool. Awesome. Well, this has been an amazing hour and 12 minutes here. I think we did a pretty good job. Thank you so much. I want to also make another big shout out to Sony as well for helping make this happen. We love Sony, and they have, like yourself, they have an amazing array of artists that shoot for them, and for good reason. You definitely deserve it. Thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And if you guys want to follow Dave online, where can they find you, Dave?
You can find me at theplanetd.com or theplanetd on every social media channel. So come check me out.
Incredible. Thanks so much, Dave. Really appreciate your time today. Have a good one, and hopefully we'll run into you soon.